At first glance, Artemis 2 looks simple. A clean launch, a bright Florida sky, 4 astronauts riding the most powerful rocket NASA has ever flown. But that is not what made this mission historic. What mattered was where they were going and what it meant. On April 1st, 2026, humanity did something it had not done in more than half a century. A crew left Earth with the moon ahead of them. Not to land, not yet, but to cross that distance again with human lives on board and prove that the path back to deep space was no longer a memory from another era. That alone would have been enough to make the mission important. But Artemis 2 carried more weight than a simple return. It was the first crewed test of Orion. It rode on top of the Space Launch System, a rocket that had become famous for delays, leaks, and rising costs. And every person watching knew the same uncomfortable truth: this mission had to work. Not just for the 4 astronauts inside the capsule, but for the future of the entire program built around it. Because this was never only about one flight. Artemis 2 was the moment NASA had to prove it could still do something incredibly hard, incredibly expensive, and undeniably dangerous. It had to show that the hardware worked, that the crew could survive the trip, that the spacecraft could leave Earth, swing around the moon, and come back through the atmosphere at extreme speed without failing when it mattered most. And even before launch, there was a reminder of how fragile all of this really was. In the final minutes, ground teams were forced to examine a worrying signal tied to the rocket's flight termination system, the mechanism designed to destroy the vehicle if it ever veered out of control. The issue turned out to be a bad reading, not a real failure. But it was enough to expose the tension hiding underneath the spectacle. Artemis 2 was not a victory lap. It was a live test of a machine that had already given NASA plenty of reasons to worry. Then the engines lit. The vehicle climbed away from the Florida coast, carrying 3 American astronauts and 1 Canadian astronaut into the first chapter of a mission years in the making. Beneath the drama of launch was something even more significant. This spacecraft was a multinational effort, assembled through contributions that stretched beyond the United States. Artemis was not just about returning to the moon. It was about building the system that might keep people going back. And once the cheering stopped, the real mission began. Because getting off the pad was only the easiest part of the story. The danger of Artemis 2 was never just the launch. It was the chain of small failures that could start quietly, almost embarrassingly, and still grow into something serious millions of miles from home. That was the real purpose of this mission. Not to perform a grand stunt around the moon, but to expose every weak point while people were finally on board. The spacecraft had flown once before without a crew. This time, every system had to operate in the real world with real bodies depending on it. Air, water, power, guidance, waste, communications. The things that sound mundane on Earth become non-negotiable in deep space. And almost immediately, Artemis 2 began to show why test flights matter. After reaching orbit, the crew did not race straight for the moon. They paused. The spacecraft was still attached to its upper stage, sitting in a high Earth orbit, while engineers and astronauts worked through a full health check. This was the moment where excitement gave way to discipline. Before committing to the longer journey, they needed to know whether Orion was truly ready. It was mostly good news. Mostly. One of the first problems came from the onboard waste system, a piece of equipment that sounds trivial until it stops working inside a sealed spacecraft. The capsule had been designed to offer a much more modern solution than the improvised methods used in the Apollo era. But hardware does not care about good intentions. A problem with the suction system meant part of that upgrade did not function as planned, forcing the crew back onto less glamorous backup procedures. It is the kind of detail that seems almost funny from a distance. But that is part of what makes spaceflight so unforgiving. There is no such thing as a small inconvenience when 4 people are locked inside a machine and moving farther from Earth by the hour. Then there was a second issue, smaller, but strangely familiar. Trouble with the crew's email accounts. On one level, it was absurd. Humanity was preparing to send astronauts around the moon, and yet even here, a login problem still found a way aboard. But that contrast says something important about Artemis 2. Spaceflight is never purely cinematic. It is always a mix of the extraordinary and the stubbornly ordinary. Precision engineering on one side, annoying human systems on the other. By the evening of April 2nd, Mission Control had what it needed. The spacecraft was cleared to leave Earth orbit and perform the burn that would send the crew outward. That decision changed everything. Up to that point, they could still turn back quickly. After it, the mission became a commitment. Their path was no longer just away from Earth. It was a loop through deep space, shaped by gravity timing, and very little room for error. And once that burn began, Artemis 2 stopped being a launch story. It became a journey. Once Artemis 2 left Earth behind, the scale of the mission changed completely. Launch is loud, orbit is technical, but the journey outward is where space begins to feel enormous. As the spacecraft moved deeper into the gap between Earth and Moon, the crew entered a view no human beings had experienced in generations. Earth was no longer the whole sky. It was shrinking. The familiar world started to look fragile, self-contained, almost unreal. Oceans, weather continents, all compressed into a single, distant sphere, hanging in blackness. And that shift in perspective was not just emotional. It was one of the mission's most valuable outcomes. From far enough away, the crew captured views of Earth that are almost impossible to get from low orbit. Images of the entire planet in one frame, not assembled from separate passes, not stitched together later. One world, all at once. That matters scientifically. It matters culturally too. Because the farther Artemis 2 traveled, the clearer it became that this mission was not only about reaching the Moon. It was about relearning how Earth looks when you are truly leaving it. Inside the spacecraft, the crew continued their work. Checks, experiments, observations. The routine of exploration is rarely dramatic in the moment, but it builds toward the moments that are. Then the Moon began to grow. Not as a symbol, not as a flat disk in the sky, but as a place, a real object with scale, texture, and complexity. As Artemis 2 approached, the crew saw something Apollo astronauts never saw in quite the same way. They were flying a much broader path, high enough to take in sweeping views instead of isolated stretches of terrain. The Moon began to fill the windows, not as a destination, but as a landscape unfolding in layers. And with human eyes on it, the surface became more than photography. The astronauts reported details. Cameras do not always capture cleanly. Subtle shifts in tone, brighter impact features standing out against darker terrain, hints of color in a world most people imagine as only gray. That distinction matters. Instruments are powerful, but human perception still adds something rare. The ability to notice contrast, shape, and texture in ways that feel immediate rather than processed. Then came one of the deepest revelations of the flight. As the spacecraft crossed toward the far side, the Moon stopped looking familiar. The side visible from Earth, marked by darker plains, gave way to a rougher and brighter face. More cratered, more ancient-looking, more violent. The contrast was striking enough to feel like crossing onto another world entirely. And in that moment, Artemis 2 was no longer just revisiting old territory. It was showing a generation the Moon as something stranger, harsher, and more alive, with unanswered questions than most people had ever imagined. The turning point of Artemis 2 did not happen at launch. It happened after the Moon. By then, the mission had already delivered its most beautiful images. The crew had watched Earth disappear behind the lunar horizon. They had crossed into the silence behind the Moon, out of contact with home, and come back with a view almost no one alive had ever seen with their own eyes. For a moment, it was possible to believe the hardest part was over. It was not. The return to Earth is where spaceflight becomes brutally narrow. There is no broad margin, no graceful recovery, no second attempt. To come home from the Moon, a spacecraft has to arrive at exactly the right angle. Too shallow, and it skips off the atmosphere and back into space. Too steep, and the heat and stress climb so fast that the vehicle can be lost in minutes. Everything now depended on precision. In the final phase of the mission, the service module lined up the capsule for reentry. Then, about 20 minutes before contact with the atmosphere, explosive bolts separated the crew cabin from the section that had carried its power, propulsion, and support systems through deep space. From that moment on, the astronauts were alone inside the blunt cone that would either protect them or fail them. The capsule rotated. Heat shield forward, Earth filling the view. Then, gravity took over. As Orion plunged downward, it accelerated to extraordinary speed, fast enough that the upper atmosphere stopped behaving like air, and started behaving like a wall of energy. Molecules compressed so violently around the vehicle that the gas outside transformed into plasma. Temperatures climbed into the thousands of degrees. Fire spread across the windows. Radio contact vanished. This is one of the most unsettling features of reentry. At the very moment the danger is greatest, the spacecraft goes silent. For several long minutes, Artemis 2 was unreachable. No reassuring voice from the cockpit. No immediate signal from mission control. Just a crew wrapped in superheated ionized gas, dropping through the atmosphere, at many times the speed of sound, while the outside of the spacecraft burned bright enough to be seen from tracking cameras below. Inside, the astronauts were enduring heavy deceleration as the vehicle fought to slow down without losing control. The spacecraft had to absorb the stress-shed speed, stay stable, and emerge intact on the other side of blackout. If it did, parachutes would follow. Ocean recovery would follow. History would follow. If it did not, the mission would end here within sight of home. And for Artemis, too, that was the point of no return in its purest form. They had already left Earth. Now they had to survive coming back. The silence broke before the world could panic for too long. After the blackout, Orion came back into contact with Earth. The capsule had made it through the hottest, most violent part of the descent. The structure held. The heat shield did its job. The crew was alive. For a mission built around proving whether this spacecraft could carry people beyond low Earth orbit and bring them home again, that moment mattered as much as the launch itself. Then the parachutes opened. High above the Pacific, the capsule slowed from a falling fireball to something almost gentle by comparison. The final descent carried none of the speed or violence of re-entry, only the strange calm that follows survival. At 5:07 p.m. local time off the coast of San Diego, Artemis 2 ended not with another burst of spectacle, but with a splash. 10 days after leaving Earth, the crew was back in the water, floating inside the same spacecraft that had taken them around the moon and farther from home than any humans had traveled before. Even then, the mission had one last reminder that spaceflight is never perfectly clean. There was a communications issue after Splashdown. Recovery teams could hear part of what was happening. The crew could not fully talk back. For a short time, boats circled and waited while procedures caught up with reality. It was not dramatic in the way launch or re-entry had been, but it was honest. Artemis 2 was a triumph, and still, like every real mission, it came with imperfections. Minor problems, workarounds, human systems straining beside extraordinary machines. One by one, the astronauts were helped out of the capsule and lifted to the recovery ship. Fresh air replaced the filtered atmosphere of the cabin. Medical checks began immediately. All early signs were good. The crew had endured launch, deep space, lunar flyby, isolation, re-entry, and recovery. They had tested the vehicle in the only way that really counts, by living through it. And that is why Artemis 2 matters. Not because it landed on the moon. It did not. Not because it planted a flag or built a base. It did neither. It matters because it turned ambition back into capability. It took a program that had existed in plans, hardware, and promises, and pushed it through the one threshold that changes everything: human flight. For the first time in over 50 years, people had gone out toward the moon and returned. That does not finish the story. It starts it.